Hi guys! Imagine waking up one morning and finding yourself transported back in time to the medieval world of the Crusades. No smartphone to check the weather, no refrigerator stocked with food, no running water from a tap, and definitely no internet to Google how to survive. Instead, you'd be surrounded by dirt roads, wooden carts, the smell of livestock, and the constant threat of illness, hunger, and conflict. The age of the Crusades, spanning roughly from 1095 to 1291, was a period of intense religious fervor, political intrigue, and brutal warfare that stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It was a time when knights in shining armor weren't just characters in fairy tales, but real people who lived by strict codes of honor, when entire cities could fall in a matter of days, and when the average person's life expectancy was shockingly short. For someone used to the comforts and conveniences of the 21st century, surviving even a single day in this harsh and unforgiving era would be nearly impossible. From the moment you opened your eyes, you'd face challenges that would test every aspect of your physical, mental, and emotional resilience. You'd quickly realize that the medieval world was not the romanticized version we see in movies and television shows, but rather a place of constant danger, disease, and deprivation. In this journey tonight, we're going to explore exactly why you wouldn't last a day in the age of the Crusades, examining everything from the food you'd eat to the water you'd drink, the diseases you'd encounter, the social structures you'd have to navigate, and the ever-present threat of violence that hung over every medieval community like a dark cloud. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Let's begin with the very first challenge you'd face upon waking up in the medieval world, something so fundamental that we take it completely for granted in our modern lives. Water. In the 21st century, clean drinking water is as simple as turning on a faucet. But in the age of the Crusades, access to safe water was a constant struggle that could mean the difference between life and death. Medieval people didn't understand the concept of waterborne pathogens or bacteria, so they had no effective way to purify their water supply. Most people drew water from wells, rivers, or streams that were often contaminated with human and animal waste, agricultural runoff, and all manner of pollutants. The very act of drinking water, something you do without thinking multiple times a day, could introduce deadly diseases into your system. Typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery were all common ailments spread through contaminated water, and any one of them could end your medieval adventure before it even began. The irony is that medieval people actually knew their water was dangerous, which is why they often preferred to drink ale or wine instead, even for breakfast. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval Europeans, including children, commonly drank weak ale throughout the day because the brewing process involved boiling the water, which inadvertently killed many of the harmful microorganisms. But if you were unlucky enough to find yourself in a situation where only water was available, you'd be taking a serious gamble with your health every time you took a sip. The human body can only survive about 3 days without water, so you couldn't simply abstain from drinking altogether. You'd be forced to choose between dehydration and potential poisoning, neither of which are pleasant options. Now let's talk about food, another basic necessity that would present enormous challenges in the medieval world. Forget about your favorite restaurants, grocery stores, or even the ability to order food delivery with a few taps on your phone. In the age of the Crusades, food was scarce, monotonous, and often barely edible by modern standards. The typical diet for a common person consisted primarily of bread, porridge, and pottage, which was essentially a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat were available. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries, and most people's diets were desperately lacking in essential vitamins and nutrients. Meat was expensive and rarely eaten by anyone except the wealthy nobility, and when commoners did get meat, it was often salted or dried to preserve it, making it tough, chewy, and incredibly salty. There was no refrigeration, so food spoilage was a constant problem, and people regularly ate things that were partially rotten simply because they couldn't afford to waste anything. The bread, which formed the cornerstone of the medieval diet, was often made with poorly milled flour that contained bits of stone, grit, and other contaminants that would wear down your teeth over time. Speaking of teeth, dental hygiene was virtually non-existent, and toothaches, infections, and tooth loss were common afflictions that could lead to serious health complications. The lack of dietary variety also meant that nutritional deficiencies were rampant, with diseases like scurvy, rickets, and pellagra affecting large portions of the population. If you were used to eating 3 balanced meals a day with plenty of variety, the medieval diet would leave you constantly hungry, malnourished, and craving foods that simply didn't exist yet or were impossibly expensive. Let's move on to the subject of hygiene and sanitation, or rather the shocking lack thereof in medieval society. In our modern world, we bathe regularly, wash our hands multiple times a day, brush our teeth, and use toilets with indoor plumbing. These basic practices are so ingrained in our daily routines that we perform them almost automatically. But in the age of the Crusades, personal hygiene was an entirely different matter, and the standards of cleanliness that we consider normal today would have been seen as excessive or even strange by medieval people. Most people bathed rarely, perhaps only a few times a year, because heating enough water for a full bath was time-consuming and expensive. When they did bathe, they often shared the same bath water with multiple family members, going from cleanest to dirtiest, which somewhat defeated the purpose of bathing in the first place. There was no soap as we know it, at least not for common people, and those who did have access to soap used harsh, lye-based substances that could irritate the skin. Laundry was also an infrequent affair, and people often wore the same clothes day after day until they were visibly soiled or started to smell unbearable. Undergarments were particularly problematic because they were in constant contact with the skin and absorbed sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions. The lack of regular washing meant that everyone, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest lord, harbored populations of lice, fleas, and other parasites in their clothing and hair. These parasites weren't just annoying, they were vectors for serious diseases like typhus, which could spread rapidly through communities. The toilet situation in medieval times deserves special attention because it was truly horrific by modern standards. There were no flush toilets, no toilet paper, and no sewage treatment systems. In cities, people often simply threw their waste out of windows into the streets below, shouting a warning in whatever language they spoke to alert passers-by. The streets of medieval cities were essentially open sewers, with human and animal waste mixing with mud, garbage, and rainwater to create a foul-smelling, disease-ridden soup that people had to navigate daily. In castles and wealthier homes, there might be a garderobe, which was essentially a stone seat with a hole that led to a pit or chute, dropping waste either into a moat, a cesspit, or sometimes just down the outside wall of the building. Imagine the smell and the unsanitary conditions of such an arrangement, especially in the summer heat. For peasants living in rural areas, the situation wasn't much better. They might have used an outdoor pit latrine or simply went behind a bush or tree. After using the toilet, people cleaned themselves with whatever was available, which might be leaves, moss, straw, or even just their hand, which they would then wipe on their clothing or rinse in a bucket of water. The concept of hand washing after using the toilet was not widely practiced, which meant that fecal-oral transmission of diseases was extremely common. When you combine poor sanitation with contaminated water and inadequate nutrition, you get the perfect conditions for epidemics to spread, which brings us to our next major challenge. Disease in the medieval world was everywhere, and it was far deadlier than anything most of us will encounter in our lifetimes. The age of the Crusades occurred well before the development of modern medicine, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of how diseases spread. People believed that illness was caused by bad air, called miasma, or as punishment from God for sins, or as the result of an imbalance in the body's four humors. These misconceptions led to treatments that were not only ineffective, but often actively harmful. Bloodletting, for example, was a common treatment for almost any ailment, based on the belief that removing excess blood would restore balance to the body. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients and made them more vulnerable to infection and death. Other popular treatments included applying leeches, administering purgatives and emetics to induce vomiting and diarrhea, and prescribing concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, and minerals that had no therapeutic value whatsoever. If you got sick in the medieval world, your chances of receiving effective medical care were virtually zero, and you'd be more likely to die from the treatment than from the disease itself. The list of diseases that plagued medieval Europe is staggering and includes ailments that have been largely eradicated in the developed world today. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, is perhaps the most famous medieval pandemic. And although its most devastating outbreak occurred in the mid-14th century, after the main period of the Crusades, smaller plague outbreaks occurred throughout the medieval period. The plague was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was spread by fleas living on black rats, and it killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population during its peak years. Symptoms included fever, chills, weakness, and the appearance of painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, which could grow to the size of an apple and often burst, oozing pus and blood. Death usually followed within days of the first symptoms appearing. Even if you somehow avoided the plague, you'd still have to contend with tuberculosis, leprosy, smallpox, measles, influenza, malaria, typhoid fever, dysentery, and countless other infectious diseases. Leprosy was particularly feared because it caused disfiguring skin lesions and nerve damage, and those afflicted with it were often forced to live in isolated colonies outside of towns and cities, ringing bells to warn healthy people of their approach. Smallpox left survivors covered in deep, pitted scars and often caused blindness. Measles, which we now prevent with routine childhood vaccinations, was a major killer of children in the medieval world. Even minor infections that we would treat with a simple course of antibiotics today, like an infected cut or a tooth abscess, could turn septic and lead to a slow, agonizing death. Let's consider the medical practitioners of the medieval world and what kind of help you might expect from them if you fell ill or suffered an injury. Physicians in the age of the Crusades were rare and expensive, available only to the wealthy elite, and even then, their knowledge was based on ancient texts by Galen and Hippocrates that were often misunderstood or misapplied. Medical education consisted largely of studying these classical texts rather than engaging in practical observation or experimentation, so physicians had very little actual understanding of human anatomy or physiology. Surgery was considered beneath the dignity of learned physicians and was instead performed by barber surgeons, who were essentially tradesmen with no formal medical training. These barber surgeons also cut hair, pulled teeth, and performed bloodletting alongside their surgical work. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and without any understanding of sterile technique. Imagine undergoing an amputation while fully conscious, being held down by assistants as a barber surgeon sawed through your bone with unsterilized tools, knowing that even if you survived the excruciating pain and blood loss, you'd likely die from infection in the days or weeks that followed. For most people, the only medical care available came from local wise women, herbalists, or monks and nuns who provided basic nursing care in monastery infirmaries. Some of their herbal remedies may have had genuine therapeutic properties, but many were based on superstition or magical thinking, and the overall effectiveness of medieval medicine was extremely limited. Now let's talk about the physical environment you'd find yourself in during the age of the Crusades. Forget about climate-controlled buildings, comfortable furniture, soft beds, and proper lighting. Medieval structures were drafty, dark, damp, and uncomfortable, especially for common people. Peasants lived in one-room cottages made of wattle and daub, which is a construction technique using woven wooden strips covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. These structures had dirt floors, no windows or only tiny openings covered with shutters, and a simple thatched roof that leaked when it rained and provided poor insulation against the cold. Smoke from the cooking fire had no proper chimney and instead filtered out through the roof or a hole in the wall, filling the interior with a constant haze that irritated the eyes and lungs. Families, often including several generations, shared this single room with their livestock, which were brought inside at night for warmth and protection. Imagine trying to sleep while sharing your small, dark, smoky, smelly room with your entire extended family, plus a few chickens, a goat, and maybe a pig. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist for most people. Even the wealthy lived in conditions that would seem primitive by today's standards. Stone castles and manor houses were certainly more substantial than peasant cottages, but they were cold, drafty fortresses designed primarily for defense rather than comfort. The thick stone walls that kept enemies out also kept warmth from escaping and prevented much natural light from entering. Windows were small, narrow openings covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or, in very wealthy households, expensive panes of glass that were small and thick and didn't provide much visibility. There was no central heating, so the only sources of warmth were fireplaces and braziers, which heated only the immediate area around them, while the rest of the room remained freezing, especially in winter. The floors were covered with rushes or straw that absorbed spills, dropped food, and other refuse, and these floor coverings were changed infrequently, creating a breeding ground for insects and rodents. Furniture was sparse and uncomfortable by modern standards, with hard wooden benches, chairs, and beds that offered little cushioning. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers and shared by multiple people, and they were infested with bedbugs, fleas, and lice. Sleep quality was poor, not just because of the uncomfortable sleeping conditions, but also because the medieval concept of sleep was different from ours. People often slept in two distinct periods, called first sleep and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between, because the long winter nights and lack of artificial lighting meant that trying to sleep through the entire night was impractical. Speaking of lighting, this was another major challenge in the medieval world. Once the sun went down, which in winter could be as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon, you were plunged into near total darkness. Artificial lighting was expensive, inefficient, and dim compared to what we're used to today. Candles were made from animal fat called tallow, and they produced a flickering, smoky flame and gave off an unpleasant smell as they burned. Beeswax candles were better, burning cleaner and smelling pleasant, but they were expensive and primarily used by the wealthy or in churches. Oil lamps using animal fat or vegetable oil were another option, but they too were dim, smoky, and required constant attention to keep burning. For most people, the only lighting after dark came from the cooking fire, which meant that once dinner was finished and the fire was allowed to die down, it was essentially time for bed, regardless of the hour. This meant that winter evenings were long, boring, and cold, with little to do except huddle together for warmth and perhaps tell stories or sing songs if anyone had the energy. Reading was impossible for most people, not just because of the darkness, but also because the vast majority of the population was illiterate. Books were rare and expensive, hand-copied by scribes, and available only to the educated elite and the clergy. Let's turn our attention to the social structure of medieval society, which was rigid, hierarchical, and nearly impossible to escape if you were born into the wrong class. Medieval society was organized according to the feudal system, which was essentially a pyramid of obligations and loyalties. At the top was the king, who, in theory, owned all the land in the kingdom. Below the king were the great nobles and bishops, who held large estates in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were lesser nobles, knights, and clergy. At the bottom of the pyramid were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population and did all the actual work of farming, crafting, and building that kept society functioning. Peasants were divided into two main categories, freemen and serfs. Freemen had some legal rights and could theoretically own property and move around, although in practice their options were still very limited. Serfs, on the other hand, were bound to the land and belonged to the lord who owned that land. They couldn't leave without permission, couldn't marry without permission, and had to give a portion of everything they produced to their lord. Serfs were not quite slaves, but their lack of freedom was profound and oppressive. They worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, farming the lord's land and their own small plots, and whatever surplus they managed to produce after paying rents and tithes to the lord and the church was barely enough to survive on. If you found yourself in the body of a medieval peasant, your life would be one of unrelenting toil and hardship. Farming in the medieval period was done entirely by hand or with the help of draft animals like oxen. There were no tractors, no mechanical harvesters, no pesticides, and no fertilizers except animal manure. Every aspect of agriculture was back-breaking labor, from plowing the fields to planting seeds, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and grinding grain. The work was physically exhausting and never-ending, following the rhythms of the seasons. Spring meant plowing and planting, summer meant weeding and tending the crops, autumn meant harvesting and preparing for winter, and winter meant repairing tools and equipment, caring for livestock, and trying to survive on the food you'd stored. One bad harvest due to weather, pests, or disease could mean starvation for an entire village. Famines were regular occurrences throughout the medieval period, and when crops failed, people died by the thousands. Even in good years, the peasants' diet was monotonous and barely adequate, and malnutrition was the norm rather than the exception. The working day for a medieval peasant was also far longer and more physically demanding than what most of us experience today. People worked from sunrise to sunset, which in summer could mean 15 or 16 hours of hard labor. There were no weekends off, except for Sundays and religious feast days, and even then, there were chores that had to be done regardless of the day. Child labor was also universal, with children beginning to help with simple tasks as soon as they were old enough to walk, and taking on progressively more difficult work as they grew. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period of play and education. Children were simply small adults who needed to contribute to the family's survival. Education was available only to a tiny minority, primarily boys, from wealthy families who were destined for the clergy or for positions in government. For everyone else, learning came from watching and imitating their parents and gradually acquiring the skills needed for whatever occupation they would inherit. Social mobility was virtually non-existent, and if you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant, as would your children and grandchildren for countless generations. Now, let's consider what would happen if you tried to assert your modern sensibilities and values in this medieval society. Concepts like human rights, gender equality, freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and democratic governments simply didn't exist in the age of the Crusades. Society was authoritarian, patriarchal, and deeply religious, with the Catholic Church in Western Europe and various Christian and Islamic authorities in the Middle East holding enormous power over people's lives. Questioning religious doctrine or authority could get you branded as a heretic, which was one of the worst accusations that could be leveled against anyone. Heretics were subject to interrogation, torture, and execution, often by burning at the stake, which was considered a merciful way to purify the soul through the suffering of the flesh. The Inquisition, which was established in the late 12th century to combat heresy, had the power to investigate anyone suspected of holding unorthodox beliefs, and the accused had few, if any, rights. Confessions extracted under torture were considered valid evidence, and the methods of torture used were horrific, including the rack, which stretched the body until joints dislocated, the strappado, which involved hanging someone by their wrists tied behind their back, and various other implements designed to cause maximum pain. Gender roles in medieval society were also rigidly defined and heavily skewed in favor of men. Women had almost no legal rights and were considered the property of their fathers until marriage and then the property of their husbands. A woman couldn't own property, couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't testify in court except under very limited circumstances, and had no say in whom she married. Marriages were arranged by families based on economic and political considerations, and love was not a factor. Women were expected to be obedient, submissive, and silent, and any woman who spoke out of turn or challenged male authority could be punished physically. Domestic violence was common and socially accepted, and there was no legal recourse for women who were abused by their husbands. Women's primary roles were to bear and raise children and to manage the household, and their worth was often judged by their ability to produce male heirs. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with high rates of maternal mortality due to complications like hemorrhaging, infection, and obstructed labor. There were no cesarean sections for living mothers, no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, and no effective pain relief. Many women died in childbirth or shortly after, and infant mortality was also shockingly high, with perhaps 1 in 3 children dying before their 5th birthday. If you were a woman transported back to the age of the Crusades, your life expectancy would be even shorter than that of men, and you would have virtually no autonomy or control over your own life. Let's talk about the legal system of the medieval world, which would seem bizarre and unjust by modern standards. The concept of innocent until proven guilty did not exist, and trials were often decided by methods that had nothing to do with evidence or reasoned argument. Trial by ordeal was a common practice, based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent. Accused persons might be forced to hold a red-hot iron bar, plunge their hand into boiling water, or be bound and thrown into a river. If their burns healed quickly without infection, or if they sank in the water rather than floating, they were considered innocent. If their wounds became infected, or if they floated, they were guilty. Obviously, these methods had no correlation with actual guilt or innocence and resulted in many unjust convictions. Trial by combat was another option for the nobility, where disputes were settled by armed combat between the accuser and the accused, or their champions. The winner of the fight was considered to be in the right, regardless of the actual facts of the case. Punishments for crimes were harsh and often brutal, designed to be painful and humiliating as both punishment and deterrent. Theft might result in having a hand cut off. Lying might result in having the tongue cut out. And more serious crimes like murder or treason were punished by hanging, beheading, or drawing and quartering, which involved being partially hanged, then disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded and having the body cut into pieces. Public executions were popular entertainment, drawing crowds of spectators who viewed the suffering of the condemned as both justice and a warning. Now let's discuss the Crusades themselves, which were the defining military and religious conflicts of this era. The Crusades began in 1095, when Pope Urban II called for a holy expedition to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. Tens of thousands of people, from knights and nobles to common soldiers and even non-combatants, took up the cross and embarked on the long, dangerous journey to the Middle East. The First Crusade was surprisingly successful, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, but this victory came at a terrible cost. When the Crusaders finally breached the walls of Jerusalem, they went on a rampage through the city, engaging in widespread violence against the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Chronicles from both Christian and Muslim sources describe scenes of horrific carnage, with thousands of people losing their lives. The streets reportedly ran with blood, and the brutality of the conquest left a lasting legacy of bitterness and mistrust that persists to this day. Subsequent crusades were less successful, and the Holy Land changed hands multiple times over the following 2 centuries, with neither side able to achieve a lasting victory. If you found yourself caught up in the Crusades, whether as a crusader, a Muslim defender, or a civilian living in the region, your chances of survival would be slim. Travel to the Holy Land was a grueling ordeal that could take months or even years, crossing thousands of miles through hostile territory. Crusaders traveled by foot, on horseback, or by ship, facing dangers from bandits, hostile armies, disease, starvation, and the elements. Many people died long before they ever reached their destination, succumbing to illness, dehydration, exposure, or violence. The ships that carried crusaders across the Mediterranean were overcrowded, unsanitary, and prone to sinking in storms. Once in the Holy Land, crusaders faced a harsh climate they were unaccustomed to, with scorching heat in summer and cold nights in winter. Water was scarce, and supply lines were constantly under threat from enemy forces. Soldiers wore heavy armor and mail that could weigh 50 pounds or more, and marching in this equipment under the desert sun was exhausting and potentially fatal. Heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion claimed many lives, and medical care for the wounded was primitive at best. The battles themselves were brutal and terrifying, fought at close quarters with swords, axes, maces, spears, and arrows. There were no guns yet, so combat was personal and visceral, requiring physical strength, skill, and a willingness to engage in hand-to-hand violence. Soldiers faced the very real possibility of being stabbed, slashed, bludgeoned, or trampled by horses, and the wounds inflicted by medieval weapons were horrific. A sword cut could sever limbs or open deep gashes that bled profusely. A mace blow could shatter bones and crush skulls. Arrows could pierce armor and vital organs, causing slow, agonizing deaths. Even if you survived the initial injury, the lack of effective medical treatment meant that infection was almost inevitable. Wounded soldiers were often left on the battlefield to die, and those who were captured might be enslaved, tortured, or executed, depending on the whims of their captors. The psychological trauma of medieval warfare was also immense, and many soldiers suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time such conditions were not understood or acknowledged. Soldiers witnessed and participated in horrific acts of violence, saw their comrades die in terrible ways, and lived with the constant fear of death or injury. There was no counseling, no mental health support, and no concept that psychological wounds needed healing just as much as physical ones. Let's consider the logistics of being part of a crusader army. Medieval armies were not the disciplined, well-supplied fighting forces we might imagine from watching movies. They were often little more than armed mobs, lacking centralized command structures, reliable supply chains, or consistent training. Soldiers were expected to provide their own equipment and provisions, which meant that the quality of armor, weapons, and supplies varied wildly depending on individual wealth. Knights and nobles had the best equipment, wearing full suits of mail armor, carrying high-quality swords and lances, and riding trained war horses. Common soldiers made do with whatever they could afford or scavenge, often wearing nothing more than quilted cloth armor and carrying simple weapons like spears or clubs. Food supplies were always a concern. and armies often resorted to foraging, which was a polite term for stealing from the local population. When supplies ran low, soldiers faced the choice of starvation or desertion, and many chose to abandon the cause and try to make their way home. Disease ran rampant through military camps, where thousands of men lived in close proximity with poor sanitation, contaminated water, and inadequate food. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses killed far more crusaders than enemy action ever did. The religious motivation behind the Crusades was intense and deeply personal for many participants. Medieval Europeans lived in a world saturated with religious belief, and the promise of spiritual rewards for participating in a crusade was a powerful motivator. Pope Urban and subsequent popes promised that crusaders who died in the effort would have all their sins forgiven and would go directly to heaven, bypassing the punishments of purgatory. For medieval people who believed absolutely in the reality of hell and the need for salvation, this was an incredible offer. However, the reality of the Crusades often fell far short of the spiritual ideals that inspired them. The violence, greed, and political maneuvering that characterized the Crusades revealed the very human flaws of those involved, and many crusaders were motivated as much by the prospect of land, wealth, and adventure as by religious devotion. The sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christian crusaders attacked and looted a Christian city, demonstrated how far the movement had strayed from its original purpose. Let's imagine what your daily routine might look like if you somehow survived your first day in the age of the Crusades and had to continue living in this harsh world. You would wake up at dawn, cold and stiff from sleeping on a hard surface, probably sharing a bed with other people, and certainly sharing your sleeping space with insects and rodents. There would be no alarm clock to wake you, just the gradually increasing light coming through the cracks in the walls or shutters. You would relieve yourself in whatever primitive toilet facilities were available, with no toilet paper and no privacy. You would not brush your teeth because toothbrushes hadn't been invented yet, and you might rinse your mouth with water or wine if you were lucky. You would not shower or bathe because that was not a daily activity. You would put on the same clothes you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Clothes that were stiff with dried sweat and dirt and crawling with lice. For breakfast, if you ate breakfast at all, you might have a piece of stale bread and some weak ale, or perhaps some leftover pottage from the night before. The food would be bland, barely filling, and lacking in nutritional value, leaving you hungry and already thinking about your next meal. Then you would begin your work for the day, which would be physically demanding and monotonous. Then you would begin your work for the day, which would be physically demanding and monotonous. If you were a peasant, you would head out to the fields to plow, plant, weed, or harvest, depending on the season, working with simple tools and using the strength of your own back. If you were a craftsman, you would go to your workshop to practice your trade, whether that was blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, or any of the other essential crafts. If you were a merchant, you would tend your shop or set up your stall in the market, trying to sell your goods and make enough profit to survive. If you were a noble or knight, you would spend your time training for war, hunting, overseeing your estates, and engaging in the political intrigues of the court. Whatever your station in life, you would work hard for long hours with few breaks. Lunch, if you had it, would be similar to breakfast, another piece of bread and some ale, or perhaps some cheese if you were fortunate. You would eat quickly and get back to work, because there was always more work to be done. The afternoon would stretch on endlessly, with the sun beating down in summer or the cold wind biting in winter, and your body would ache from the constant exertion. You would see people around you suffering from injuries and illnesses, and you would know that the same fate could befall you at any moment. You would witness casual cruelty and violence, whether it was a lord punishing a serf, a public whipping or execution, or simply the everyday roughness with which people treated each other. You would hear coarse language, see open displays of bodily functions, and be surrounded by smells that would make you gag, the smell of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting garbage, and human sewage. Finally, as the sun began to set, you would finish your work and head home for the evening meal. Dinner would be the main meal of the day, and it might consist of pottage, bread, and maybe a bit of cheese or some vegetables. If you were very lucky, there might be a small piece of salted fish or meat, but this would be rare. You would eat with your fingers, because forks hadn't come into common use yet, and you might share a trencher, which was a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate, with other members of your household. After dinner, you would sit around the fire for a short time, perhaps talking with your family or neighbors, perhaps singing songs or telling stories, perhaps praying. As darkness fell and the fire died down, you would prepare for bed, lying down on your hard, uncomfortable mattress, pulling a thin blanket over yourself and trying to sleep despite the cold, the discomfort, the hunger, the itching from insect bites, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your likely short life. One aspect of medieval life that we haven't fully explored yet is the constant presence of violence and the threat of violence. The age of the Crusades was a time of almost perpetual warfare, not just the large-scale conflicts between Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land, but also smaller conflicts between rival nobles, between kingdoms, between cities, and even between villages. Violence was an accepted part of life, and people were much more accustomed to witnessing brutality than we are today. Public executions, as mentioned earlier, were attended by crowds who treated them as entertainment. Punishments were designed to be painful and humiliating, with criminals displayed in stocks or pillories where passers-by could throw garbage at them, insult them, or even assault them. Warfare was not confined to battlefields. Armies frequently ravaged the countryside, burning crops, destroying homes, stealing livestock, and terrorizing civilian populations. The concept of civilian immunity from military violence did not exist, and ordinary people often suffered the worst consequences of conflicts they had no say in. Even in times of nominal peace, violence was common in everyday life. Disputes between neighbors might escalate quickly into physical confrontations, and there was no effective police force to intervene. Men often carried weapons and were quick to use them if they felt insulted or threatened. Honor was everything in medieval society, and perceived slights demanded a response, often a violent one. Taverns and alehouses, which were the main social gathering places for common people, were notorious for drunken brawls that could turn deadly. Robbery and banditry were constant threats, especially for travelers, and roads were dangerous places where you might encounter thieves, outlaws, or deserters from armies who had turned to crime to survive. Women faced additional dangers, including the very real threat of assault, and they had little legal protection or recourse if they were victimized. The legal system, as we discussed earlier, was not designed to protect ordinary people or ensure justice in any modern sense. Instead, it was designed to maintain the power of the ruling class and to punish those who transgressed against that power. Laws were enforced inconsistently and often arbitrarily, depending on the whims of local lords or the ability of the accused to pay bribes. Corruption was endemic at every level of medieval society, and those with money and connections could often escape punishment for crimes that would see a poor person executed. The concept of proportional punishment did not exist, and the same crime might result in wildly different sentences depending on who committed it and who was judging it. This created a society where might made right, and where the weak and poor had no real protection against the strong and wealthy. Let's think about the psychological impact of living in such a world. Modern people are accustomed to a certain level of security, predictability, and comfort in our lives. We expect to live long lives, to see our children grow up, to have access to medical care when we're sick, to have enough food to eat, and to be relatively safe from violence. We have systems in place, however imperfect, to protect our rights and ensure some measure of justice. We have education, entertainment, and opportunities for personal growth and fulfillment. The medieval world offered none of these things for the vast majority of people. Life was short, brutal, and filled with suffering, and there was no expectation that things would or could get better. The concept of progress, of society improving over time, did not exist. People believed that the world was in a state of decline from a golden age in the past, and that the best they could hope for was to endure their earthly suffering and be rewarded in the afterlife. This worldview had profound effects on medieval psychology. People were fatalistic, believing that their lives were controlled by forces beyond their control, whether that was God's will, the movements of the stars, or simple bad luck. There was little sense of individual agency or the ability to change one's circumstances through hard work or determination. Social mobility was virtually impossible, so people accepted their station in life as divinely ordained. This acceptance could provide a certain stability and peace of mind, a sense of knowing one's place and purpose in the grand scheme of things. But it also meant that innovation was discouraged, that questioning authority was dangerous, and that entire generations of people lived and died without ever experiencing anything like freedom, comfort, or self-determination. The role of religion in medieval life cannot be overstated. For medieval people, religion was not just a set of beliefs held privately. It was the organizing principle of all existence. The Church was the dominant institution in Western Europe, more powerful than any king or emperor, and it controlled not just spiritual matters, but also education, healthcare, charity, and large portions of the economy. The clergy formed a separate class within society, with their own laws, courts, and privileges. Monasteries and convents were centers of learning and agricultural production, and monks and nuns provided many of the social services that we would today expect from government or secular organizations. The church calendar structured the year, with religious feast days and holy days breaking up the monotony of work. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest dedicated to worship, though peasants still had essential chores to do regardless of the day. Religious observance was mandatory and public. Everyone was expected to attend Mass regularly, to confess their sins to a priest, to receive communion, and to participate in the rituals of the Church. Failure to do so could result in punishment from both religious and secular authorities. Excommunication, the formal exclusion from the Church and its sacraments, was one of the most severe punishments that could be inflicted on a person, because it meant not only social ostracism in this life, but also, according to Church teaching, eternal punishment in the next. The threat of hell was very real and terrifying to medieval people, who believed absolutely in the reality of eternal torment for sinners. Preachers described hell in vivid, gruesome detail, painting pictures of demons, fire, torment, and suffering that would last forever. This fear of damnation was a powerful tool for social control, keeping people obedient to both religious and secular authority. The Church also promoted certain beliefs and practices that would seem strange or even harmful to us today. The veneration of relics, which were physical remains or belongings of saints, was extremely important, and people believed that these objects had miraculous powers to heal the sick, protect against danger, or grant blessings. Churches and cathedrals competed to acquire important relics, and pilgrimages to sites containing famous relics were major undertakings that could take months or years. The buying and selling of relics was a lucrative business, and fraud was rampant, with countless fake relics being passed off as authentic. People also sought intercession from saints, praying to them for help with specific problems or needs, believing that saints could intercede with God on their behalf. This led to a complex system of patronage, with different saints associated with different professions, ailments, or concerns. Superstition and folk belief blended seamlessly with official church doctrine in the minds of most medieval people. They believed in magic, witchcraft, demons, fairies, and all manner of supernatural beings. When bad things happened, whether it was crop failure, livestock disease, or human illness, people looked for supernatural explanations and supernatural solutions. Charms, amulets, and spells were commonly used alongside prayers and sacraments. Wise women and cunning folk who practiced traditional healing and folk magic were consulted by people at all levels of society, despite the Church's official disapproval of such practices. This created a rich but confusing spiritual landscape where Christian theology, pagan survivals, and local folk traditions all coexisted and influenced each other. Now let's consider what would happen if you tried to use your modern knowledge to improve your situation in the medieval world. You might think that your education and understanding of science, technology, and medicine would give you a huge advantage, allowing you to introduce innovations that would make you wealthy and respected. In reality, trying to introduce modern ideas into medieval society would be extremely difficult and potentially dangerous. First, you would face the problem of credibility. You would be an unknown person with no family connections, no guild membership, no education credentials that medieval people would recognize, and no social standing. Anything you said or did would be viewed with suspicion, especially if it contradicted established beliefs or practices. If you tried to explain that diseases were caused by tiny organisms invisible to the naked eye, people would think you were insane. If you tried to introduce sanitary practices like hand washing and boiling water, people would see no reason to adopt these strange behaviors. Even if you could convince people to try your ideas, you would quickly run into practical problems. You couldn't build most modern devices because you wouldn't have access to the materials or manufacturing capabilities needed. You couldn't make electricity work without copper wire, generators, and a host of other components. You couldn't make a steam engine without precision machined parts and an understanding of metallurgy that went far beyond what medieval blacksmiths possessed. You couldn't make antibiotics without modern laboratory equipment, pharmaceutical knowledge, and quality control. You couldn't perform modern surgery without anesthesia, antibiotics, blood transfusions, and all the other support systems that make surgery safe. Even simple things like making soap, matches, or basic tools would be much harder than you might think without access to modern materials and equipment. More fundamentally, you would face resistance from the established powers in medieval society who benefited from the status quo. If you tried to introduce innovations that threatened the economic interests of guilds, the political power of nobles, or the spiritual authority of the church, you would make powerful enemies. The guild system was designed specifically to prevent innovation and competition, maintaining strict control over who could practice various trades and how those trades were conducted. If you tried to set up your own workshop and produce goods using new methods, the local guild would shut you down, possibly violently. If your innovations threatened the church's teachings about the nature of the world or humanity's place in it, you could be accused of heresy. The trial of Galileo in the 17th century, well after the medieval period, shows how dangerous it could be to promote ideas that contradicted church doctrine, and the consequences in the age of the Crusades would have been even more severe. Let's talk about travel and communication in the medieval world, two more areas where the difference from modern life would be stark and challenging. Today, we can travel across continents in hours by plane, communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world, and access virtually unlimited information through the internet. In the age of the Crusades, travel was slow, dangerous, and expensive, and most people never ventured more than a few miles from the place where they were born. Roads were primitive, often nothing more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in rain and were full of potholes and obstacles. There were no road signs, no maps for ordinary travelers, and no reliable directions. Bridges were rare and poorly maintained, so rivers often had to be forded, which was dangerous and sometimes impossible when water levels were high. People traveled on foot or, if they were wealthy, on horseback or by cart. A good day's travel might cover 20 or 30 miles, meaning that journeys we would think nothing of today could take weeks or months in medieval times. Inns existed along major routes, but they were expensive, dirty, and often dangerous, attracting criminals who preyed on travelers. Many travelers simply slept rough, camping beside the road and hoping they wouldn't be attacked during the night. Bandits were a constant threat, and traveling alone was extremely risky. Merchants often banded together in caravans for protection, and pilgrims traveled in groups for the same reason. Even then, there was no guarantee of safety, and many people who set out on journeys never arrived at their destinations. Communication over distance was equally challenging. There was no postal system for ordinary people, no way to send a quick message to someone far away. Letters could be sent with travelers or merchants who were headed in the right direction, but there was no guarantee that the letter would arrive or that it would arrive in a reasonable time. The speed of communication was literally the speed of the fastest horse, and news of important events could take weeks or months to spread. This meant that people often had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate area, and false rumors and outdated information circulated widely. Literacy was rare, limited mostly to the clergy and a small educated elite, so even if you could get a letter delivered, the intended recipient might not be able to read it. Most communication was oral, passed person to person, which meant that messages could become garbled and distorted as they spread. This isolation had profound effects on medieval society. People's worldviews were narrow and local, focused on their immediate community and the people they knew personally. Foreign lands and peoples were mysterious and often viewed with suspicion or hostility. Stereotypes and misconceptions flourished in the absence of reliable information, and myths and legends were often believed as fact. This contributed to the religious and cultural conflicts of the era, including the Crusades themselves, which were fueled in part by mutual ignorance and misunderstanding between Christians and Muslims. Each side demonized the other, viewing them as infidels or barbarians, when in reality both civilizations were complex and sophisticated in their own ways. Let's consider the position of children in medieval society, which was very different from today. Childhood, as we understand it, as a distinct phase of life characterized by play, education, and protection from adult responsibilities, did not really exist in the medieval world. Children were viewed as small adults, and they were expected to contribute to the household economy as soon as they were physically able. Infants and toddlers were cared for by their mothers or older siblings, but once a child reached the age of about 7, they began to take on real work. Boys would help their fathers in the fields or workshops, learning the trade or craft they would practice as adults. Girls would help their mothers with cooking, cleaning, childcare, and textile work like spinning and weaving. This was not a few hours of chores after school. This was full-time work from dawn to dusk, the same as adults. Education for most children consisted of learning by doing, acquiring practical skills through apprenticeship and imitation. Formal schooling was available only to a tiny minority, primarily boys from wealthy families or those destined for the clergy. These children would be sent to cathedral schools or monasteries, where they would learn to read and write Latin, study scripture and classical texts, and receive training in theology, law, or medicine. For everyone else, literacy was unnecessary and even undesirable from the perspective of the ruling classes, who feared that educated commoners might challenge the social order. The few who did learn to read and write often did so because they were being trained as scribes or clerks, positions that required literacy but were still relatively low in social status. Child mortality was shockingly high by modern standards, with somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of all children dying before reaching adulthood. Infant mortality was particularly high, with many babies dying in their first year from disease, malnutrition, or complications related to childbirth. Parents had many children partly because they expected that not all of them would survive, and this created a different emotional dynamic in parent-child relationships. While parents certainly loved their children, they also had to protect themselves emotionally from the very real possibility of loss, and this may have led to a certain emotional distance that would seem cold to us today. Children who did survive faced all the same dangers as adults, from disease and malnutrition to accidents and violence, and they had little protection from exploitation or abuse. Child labor was universal and unregulated, and children worked in dangerous conditions with no safety equipment or legal protections. One particularly disturbing aspect of medieval childhood was the practice of sending children away from home at young ages. Noble children might be sent to serve in other noble households as pages or ladies-in-waiting, learning the skills and manners appropriate to their class, while also serving as hostages to guarantee their family's good behavior. Peasant children might be sent away as servants or apprentices, living with their masters and working for little or no wages. This separation from family at such tender ages must have been traumatic for many children, but it was seen as necessary for their education and socialization. The emotional impact on these children was not considered important. What mattered was that they learn their place in society and acquire the skills they would need to fulfill their appointed roles. Let's examine the medieval understanding of science and the natural world, which was fundamentally different from our modern scientific worldview. Medieval people did not think in terms of natural laws, empirical observation, or experimental testing. Instead, they understood the world through a combination of religious doctrine, classical texts, and folk tradition. The ultimate authority on all questions was the Bible and the teachings of the Church, and any observations or ideas that contradicted Scripture were automatically rejected as false. The earth was believed to be the center of the universe, with the sun, moon, stars, and planets revolving around it in crystalline spheres. This geocentric model was supported by the Church because it placed humanity and Earth at the center of God's creation, and it remained the official view until well into the early modern period. The natural world was understood through the lens of symbolism and divine purpose rather than through cause and effect. Animals, plants, and natural phenomena were believed to have been created by God to serve human needs or to teach moral lessons. Bestiaries, which were popular books describing real and imaginary animals, attributed moral qualities to animals and explained their behaviors in terms of religious symbolism rather than natural history. For example, the pelican was said to pierce its own breast to feed its young with its blood, making it a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. The fact that pelicans don't actually do this was irrelevant. The symbolic meaning was what mattered. This approach to knowledge meant that medieval people were not particularly concerned with whether their beliefs about the natural world were accurate in a factual sense. What mattered was whether those beliefs supported the larger framework of Christian theology and moral teaching. Medicine, as we've discussed, was based on the theory of the four humors, which held that the body contained four fluids in blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that needed to be kept in balance for health. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance of these humors, and treatments were designed to restore balance through bloodletting, purging, or adjusting diet. This theory had originated with ancient Greek physicians and had been passed down through centuries without significant modification or challenge. Medieval physicians had very limited knowledge of anatomy because dissection of human bodies was prohibited by the Church for most of the medieval period. What knowledge they did have came from dissections of animals or from ancient texts that contained significant errors. The idea of conducting experiments to test medical theories or of carefully observing patients to understand disease processes was not part of medieval medical practice. Physicians relied on authority and tradition rather than evidence. This reliance on authority extended to all areas of knowledge. The writings of ancient philosophers like Aristotle were treated as almost infallible, and the goal of scholars was to understand and explain these texts rather than to challenge or expand upon them. Universities, which began to develop in the late medieval period, taught students through lectures and disputations focused on classical texts and church doctrine. The idea of original research, or the advancement of knowledge through investigation of the natural world, was largely absent. This created a stagnant intellectual environment where the same ideas were recycled generation after generation with little progress or innovation. The few individuals who did try to push boundaries or introduce new ideas faced enormous resistance from the established authorities and often paid a heavy price for their intellectual curiosity. Now let's think about the sensory experience of being in the medieval world, something that would be profoundly different from our modern environment. We've mentioned the smells, which would be overwhelming and constant, but there would also be the sounds of a pre-industrial world. Without engines, electronics, or recorded music, the soundscape would be dominated by natural and human-produced noises. You would hear the sounds of animals everywhere, from the crowing of roosters at dawn to the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep and goats, the grunting of pigs, and the clucking of chickens. You would hear church bells ringing out the hours and calling people to prayer, serving as the primary timekeeping method for communities. You would hear human voices engaged in conversation, argument, singing, praying, and shouting, and the quality of those voices would be different from today because people spoke with regional accents and dialects that have long since disappeared or evolved into modern forms. You would hear the sounds of manual labor, the ring of hammer on anvil in the blacksmith's forge, the sawing and hammering of carpenters, the splash of laundry being beaten clean in the river, the grinding of millstones turning grain into flour. You would hear the sounds of travel, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the creak of cartwheels, the jingle of harness and tack. You would hear the sounds of violence, the clash of weapons in combat, the screams of pain and terror, the jeers of crowds at public punishments. You would also hear long periods of relative quiet, especially at night, when the world truly fell silent in a way that is almost impossible to experience in our modern age of constant ambient noise. The visual experience would be equally striking. We're accustomed to a world of bright, artificial lighting, colorful advertisements, manufactured goods, and architecture designed for aesthetics as well as function. The medieval world would seem dim and drab by comparison, with most buildings constructed of gray stone or brown wood and wattle and daub, most people wearing clothing in natural earth tones like brown, gray, and undyed off-white. Bright colors existed, but were expensive, produced from natural dyes that were difficult to obtain and process. The very wealthy might have clothing in rich reds, blues, purples, and greens, but for most people, colorful clothing was reserved for special occasions, if they had it at all. The streets would be narrow, winding, and unpaved, with buildings leaning close together overhead, blocking much of the sunlight. At night, the darkness would be absolute, except for the weak glow of fires and candles, and the stars would be visible with a clarity impossible in our light-polluted modern world. Architecture in the medieval world was dominated by practical considerations rather than aesthetic ones, at least for common structures. Peasant cottages were small, simple, and designed purely for shelter. Even wealthy manors and castles, while more substantial, were primarily defensive structures with thick walls, narrow windows, and limited ornamentation. The major exception was church architecture, where enormous resources were poured into creating buildings that were designed to inspire awe and reflect the glory of God. The great cathedrals of the medieval period, with their soaring heights, intricate stone carvings, and brilliant stained glass windows, represented the pinnacle of medieval artistic and technical achievement. For peasants who lived their entire lives in small, dark, cramped cottages, entering a cathedral must have been an overwhelming experience, and this was precisely the intention. The Church wanted to demonstrate its power and importance through architecture that dwarfed and humbled ordinary people. Let's discuss money and economics in the medieval world, another area where your modern understanding would be of limited help. The medieval economy was fundamentally different from our modern capitalist system, operating primarily on principles of subsistence agriculture and barter rather than market exchange and wage labor. Most people were not paid in money for their work, but instead produced most of what they needed themselves and traded for the rest. Peasants grew their own food, made their own clothing from wool or linen they produced themselves, built their own shelters, and created their own tools and household items. When they needed something they couldn't produce themselves, they would trade with neighbors or with traveling merchants, exchanging goods or services rather than using currency. Money did exist in the form of metal coins made from gold, silver, or copper, but it was relatively scarce and was used primarily by merchants, nobles, and urban dwellers rather than by the peasant majority. The value of coins was determined by their metal content rather than by any guarantee from a central authority, and people often bit coins to test whether they were genuine or had been debased by mixing the precious metal with cheaper metals. There was no paper money, no credit cards, no banking system as we know it, although some basic banking services were provided by Jewish moneylenders and later by Italian merchant families. The Church officially prohibited usury, which was the charging of interest on loans, considering it a sin, but this prohibition was often circumvented through various legal fictions and loopholes. The feudal economy was based on obligations and relationships rather than free market exchanges. Peasants owed labor services to their lords, working the lord's land for a certain number of days each week in addition to farming their own plots. They also owed various rents and fees, paid in produce or sometimes in money, and they were subject to additional obligations like helping to maintain roads and bridges, serving in the lord's army when required, and paying special fees for the use of the lord's mill, oven, or wine press. These were monopolies that the lord maintained, forcing peasants to use his facilities and pay for the privilege. The lord, in turn, owed military service and loyalty to his overlord, and so on up the chain to the king. This web of mutual obligations created a rigid social structure that was very different from the fluid, market-based economy we're familiar with today. Let's consider what entertainment and leisure looked like in the medieval world, because all work and no play would have been even more unbearable than the work itself. Entertainment options were limited and very different from what we enjoy today. There were no movies, television, video games, recorded music, or internet, obviously, and even books were rare and expensive, available only to the wealthy and educated. For most people, entertainment consisted of simple pleasures and communal activities. Storytelling was a major form of entertainment, with traveling minstrels and bards visiting villages and towns to recite epic poems, sing songs, and tell tales of heroes, saints, and fantastic adventures. These stories served not just to entertain, but also to preserve history and cultural values in an oral tradition that stretched back centuries. Religious festivals and holy days provided regular breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. These festivals often included feasting, dancing, games, and theatrical performances of religious stories called mystery plays or miracle plays. The celebrations could be quite boisterous and included behaviors that would later be suppressed during more puritanical periods. Dancing was popular, though the church often disapproved of it as leading to immoral behavior. Music was made with simple instruments like drums, flutes, fiddles, and bagpipes, and singing was a communal activity that required no equipment at all. Drinking was a major part of social life, and alehouses served as gathering places where men, and sometimes women, could socialize, share news and gossip, and escape the drudgery of daily life for a few hours. For the nobility, entertainment options were broader and more elaborate. Hunting was not just a practical activity for obtaining food, but also a sport and a status symbol. Nobles would organize elaborate hunting expeditions, chasing deer, boar, or other game through forests with packs of trained dogs. Falconry, the practice of hunting with trained birds of prey, was another aristocratic pastime that required considerable skill and investment. Tournaments and jousts provided martial entertainment, with knights competing in mock combat for honor, glory, and prizes. These events could be dangerous, with participants suffering serious injuries or even death despite the use of blunted weapons and protective rules. Tournaments also served as social occasions, bringing together nobles from different regions and providing opportunities for political alliances, matchmaking, and displays of wealth and status. Gambling was popular at all levels of society, despite frequent prohibitions from both religious and secular authorities. People bet on dice games, card games, animal fights, and contests of skill or strength. Chess had been introduced to Europe from the Islamic world and was becoming popular among the educated classes. Simpler board games and games of chance were played by common people using whatever materials were at hand. Children played many of the same games that children still play today, like tag, hide and seek, and various ball games, though their toys were simple and homemade rather than manufactured. Dolls were made from scraps of cloth and stuffed with straw. Balls were made from inflated pig bladders. Toys and games were not purchased, but created by children themselves or by their parents. The concept of privacy, which we value so highly today, was essentially non-existent for most medieval people. Families lived together in single rooms where everyone could see and hear everything everyone else was doing. There were no separate bedrooms, no private bathrooms, no personal space where you could retreat from others. Even among the wealthy, privacy was limited. Great halls served as communal living spaces where lords, their families, their servants, and their guests all mingled together. Sleeping arrangements often involved multiple people sharing the same bed, and those who had their own beds were considered fortunate. The lack of privacy extended to bodily functions as well, with people urinating and defecating in front of others without shame or embarrassment. Modesty standards were different, and nakedness was more common and less sexualized than in later periods, though still regulated by various social norms and taboos. The treatment of mental illness in the medieval world was another area of profound ignorance and cruelty. People who suffered from what we would now recognize as mental health conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, or dementia were believed to be possessed by demons, cursed by witches, or being punished by God for their sins or the sins of their families. Treatment might involve exorcism rituals performed by priests, prayers, and pilgrimages to holy sites, or the application of various folk remedies that had no therapeutic value. In some cases, the mentally ill were simply chained up or locked away to prevent them from harming themselves or others. There was no concept of mental illness as a medical condition that could be treated with therapy or medication, and those who suffered from these conditions endured terrible lives of isolation, abuse, and misunderstanding. People with physical disabilities faced similar challenges and prejudices. Disabilities were often seen as marks of divine disfavor or as punishments for sin, and disabled individuals were stigmatized and marginalized. There were no accessibility accommodations, no assistive devices beyond the most basic crutches or prosthetics, and no legal protections or social support systems. Disabled people who could not work had to rely on charity, either from their families or from the church, and many ended up as beggars living on the margins of society. The very elderly faced similar challenges, especially if they became too infirm to care for themselves or contribute to the household economy. The concept of retirement did not exist. People worked until they physically could not anymore, and then they became dependent on others for their survival. Let's think about seasonal variations in medieval life, because the changing seasons had a much more dramatic impact on daily life than they do for most of us today. Winter was the harshest season, a time of cold, darkness, hunger, and hardship. Agricultural work slowed down, but there were still animals to care for, tools to repair, and preparations to make for spring planting. Food was scarce because nothing could be grown during the winter months, and people had to survive on whatever they had managed to store from the previous harvest. Preserved foods like salted meat, dried fish, pickled vegetables, and grain dominated the winter diet, and as the season wore on, supplies dwindled and the specter of starvation loomed. Heating was inadequate, and people suffered from the cold, huddling together for warmth and rarely being truly comfortable. Chilblains, frostbite, and hypothermia were common winter ailments, and death rates spiked during the coldest months. Spring brought relief and renewal, but it was also a time of hard work, as fields had to be prepared and planted. This was a race against time, because crops planted too late might not mature before the next winter, leading to food shortages and famine. Spring was also a hungry time, because winter food stores were exhausted, and the new crops had not yet come in. This period, sometimes called the hungry gap or the lean months, was when malnutrition was most severe and when the weakest members of society were most likely to succumb. Summer was the best season, with warm weather, long days, and fresh food available. Fields had to be weeded and tended, but the work was less urgent than planting or harvesting. People could eat fresh vegetables, berries, and dairy products, and their nutrition and health improved. Summer was also when most festivals and celebrations occurred, taking advantage of the good weather and relatively abundant food supply. Autumn was harvest time, the most critical period of the entire year. The success or failure of the harvest would determine whether the community survived the coming winter or faced starvation. Everyone worked frantically to bring in the crops before bad weather could destroy them, working from dawn to dusk and beyond. The harvest was followed by a brief period of celebration and relative plenty, but then attention quickly turned to preparing for winter once again. This annual cycle dominated medieval life, creating a rhythm of scarcity and abundance, hard work and brief respite that governed everything people did. We should also discuss the medieval understanding of time, which was very different from our modern clock-based system. Mechanical clocks did not come into common use until late in the medieval period, and even then they were expensive and found only in churches and wealthy households. Most people told time by the position of the sun, dividing the day into periods that varied in length depending on the season. The concept of hours of equal length was not practical or particularly useful for people whose activities were determined by daylight and the demands of agricultural work. Monastic communities used a system of canonical hours, dividing the day and night into 8 periods for prayer, but this was not widely adopted by the general population. Without clocks, punctuality as we understand it did not exist. Appointments might be set for morning or afternoon, or for when the sun reached a certain position, but precise timing was impossible and unnecessary. People's sense of time was more fluid and flexible, governed by natural rhythms and seasonal changes rather than by minutes and hours. This had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, there was less stress about being exactly on time for things and less sense of time as a scarce resource that must be carefully managed and optimized. On the other hand, coordinating activities and scheduling events was more difficult, and the lack of precise timekeeping made certain kinds of organization and planning impossible. The medieval calendar was also different from our modern Gregorian calendar. The Julian calendar was in use during the Crusades era, and it had a slight inaccuracy that caused it to drift relative to the solar year. This drift would eventually lead to calendar reform in the 16th century, but during the medieval period, it meant that the dates of equinoxes and solstices slowly shifted. More importantly for most people, the calendar was structured around religious observances rather than numbered days and months. People might refer to dates as being a certain number of days before or after a saint's day or feast day, rather than using the day and month system we're familiar with. The concept of years was less important than the cycle of seasons and the church calendar of holy days, which structured people's experience of time. Let's talk about what would happen if you got injured in the medieval world, because accidents were common and medical treatment was primitive at best. Simple cuts and scrapes that we would clean and bandage without much thought could turn into serious infections in a world without antibiotics or even a basic understanding of germ theory. People used whatever was at hand to clean wounds, which might be water, wine, urine, or even dung in some folk remedies. They might apply cobwebs, bread mold, or various herbal poultices, some of which had genuine antimicrobial poultices, but many of which did more harm than good. If an infection set in, it could spread rapidly, causing fever, swelling, pain, and eventually sepsis and death. There was no effective treatment for serious infections, and people simply had to hope that their body's natural defenses would fight off the infection or accept that they would die. More serious injuries, like broken bones, were set by bone setter, who were often not trained physicians, but rather craftsmen who had learned the skill through apprenticeship. They would align the broken bone as best they could, then immobilize the limb with splints made from wood, cloth, and whatever other materials were available. There was no pain relief during this process beyond perhaps some alcohol to dull the senses. If the bone was set properly and no infection developed, it might heal reasonably well, though often with some deformity or loss of function. If the break was compound, meaning the bone pierced the skin, the risk of infection was extremely high, and amputation might be necessary. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, with the patient held down by strong assistance while the barber surgeon cut through flesh and bone with a saw, then cauterized the stump with a red-hot iron to stop the bleeding. The pain was indescribable, and many patients died from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Burns were another common injury in a world where open fires were used for cooking, heating, and lighting. Minor burns might be treated with butter, honey, or various herbal salves, some of which had genuine soothing properties. Severe burns, however, were often fatal, leading to infection, fluid loss, and organ failure. The same was true for crush injuries, which occurred frequently in agricultural and construction work. Without modern trauma medicine, intensive care, or surgical capabilities, people with serious internal injuries had little chance of survival. Even relatively minor internal bleeding could be fatal because there was no way to diagnose or treat it. Eye injuries and loss of vision were common, resulting from accidents, infections, or diseases. Cataracts, which cloud the lens of the eye, could be treated through a crude procedure called couching, where a sharp instrument was used to push the clouded lens back into the eye. This sometimes restored some degree of vision, but it was risky and often resulted in complications. Most other eye conditions were untreatable, and blindness was simply a fact of life that one had to accept. Blind people became dependent on others for survival and often ended up as beggars, relying on charity to stay alive. Dental problems, which we've touched on briefly, deserve more attention because they were incredibly common and caused enormous suffering. Tooth decay was rampant due to poor nutrition, lack of oral hygiene, and the gritty nature of bread, which wore down tooth enamel. Toothaches could be excruciating and persistent, making it difficult to eat, sleep, or function normally. The only treatment was extraction, which was performed by barbers or traveling tooth pullers using simple pliers or forceps. Again, there was no anesthesia, and the procedure was agonizing. After extraction, the empty socket could become infected, leading to abscesses that could spread to the jaw and even to the brain, causing death. Many people lost most or all of their teeth by middle age, making it difficult to eat solid food and contributing to further malnutrition. Let's consider the experience of women during pregnancy and childbirth, which was one of the most dangerous times in a woman's life. Pregnancy itself was challenging in a world without prenatal care, ultrasounds, or understanding of fetal development. Women continued to work throughout pregnancy, often performing heavy physical labor right up until the moment of birth. Malnutrition was common, and many women did not get adequate nutrition to support both themselves and a growing fetus. There were no pregnancy tests, so women often did not know for certain that they were pregnant until they felt fetal movement, which typically occurs around 4 or 5 months. Miscarriages were common but rarely discussed, and women who suffered repeated miscarriages might be blamed for moral failings or suspected of witchcraft. Childbirth took place at home, attended by midwives rather than physicians, since male physicians considered it beneath their dignity to be involved in childbirth. Midwives were women who had learned their craft through experience and apprenticeship, and their skill varied widely. Some were knowledgeable and competent, while others relied on superstition and folklore that could be actively harmful. Labor could last for days, with the woman enduring wave after wave of contractions without effective pain relief. If the baby was positioned correctly and labor progressed normally, the midwife would guide the birth and cut the umbilical cord. But if there were complications, such as a breech presentation, twins, or obstructed labor, the situation became life-threatening for both mother and baby. There were no emergency cesarean sections for living mothers during the medieval period. The operation was occasionally performed after a mother's death in an attempt to save the baby, but it was never done on a living woman because it was believed to be invariably fatal. If labor became obstructed and the baby could not be delivered naturally, the midwife might use hooks or other instruments to dismember the baby in the womb and extract it piece by piece, a horrifying process that was meant to save the mother's life even though the baby would not survive. Even if the birth went smoothly, the mother faced risks of hemorrhaging, infection of the uterus or birth canal, and other postpartum complications. Many women died within days or weeks of giving birth from childbed fever, which we now know was caused by bacterial infection, but which medieval people attributed to many causes, including bad air or divine punishment. Babies who survived birth faced their own challenges. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of babies dying in their first year. Premature babies had almost no chance of survival without modern neonatal intensive care. Babies born with birth defects or disabilities were sometimes viewed as changelings, fairy children swapped for the human baby, and might be neglected or even harmed. Breastfeeding was the only option for feeding infants, since there was no safe formula, and if a mother could not breastfeed, the baby would need a wet nurse, which was expensive and only available to wealthy families. Poor mothers who could not nurse and could not afford a wet nurse had to watch their babies starve. Weaning typically occurred around age 2 or 3, and the transition to solid food was another dangerous time, since the food available to medieval children was often poorly suited to their nutritional needs and difficult for them to digest. Let's think about the psychological and emotional toll of living in such a world. Modern people have the luxury of believing that we have some control over our lives, that we can plan for the future, that hard work and good decisions will lead to better outcomes. Medieval people had no such illusions. They knew that their lives could be upended at any moment by forces beyond their control: disease, famine, war, accidents, or simply bad luck. This created a worldview characterized by fatalism and resignation, but also by a certain kind of resilience and acceptance. People learned to endure suffering because they had no choice, and they found meaning and comfort in their religious faith, which promised that their earthly suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife. The medieval concept of happiness was also different from ours. We tend to think of happiness as a state of contentment, satisfaction, and pleasure that we should actively pursue and expect to achieve. Medieval people were more likely to think of happiness as something transient and fleeting, moments of joy snatched from a life of hardship. They expected suffering and viewed it as an inevitable part of the human condition, something to be endured rather than avoided. This might sound bleak to us, but it may have actually provided a kind of psychological protection, a way of coping with circumstances that were genuinely terrible by modern standards. By not expecting life to be easy or pleasant, medieval people may have been less disappointed and less psychologically damaged by the hardships they faced. The sense of community was also much stronger in medieval society than in our modern individualistic culture. People depended on their neighbors, their kin, and their fellow villagers for survival, and this created tight bonds of mutual obligation and support. When someone's house burned down, the community would come together to help rebuild it. When someone fell ill, neighbors would help with their work and care for their family. When times were hard, people shared what little they had. This communal spirit was not just altruism, it was practical necessity in a world where there were no insurance companies, no government safety nets, and no other forms of institutional support. You helped others because you knew that someday you would need help yourself, and the community was your only source of it. However, this tight-knit community structure also had a dark side. There was intense social pressure to conform to community norms and expectations, and those who deviated or stood out were viewed with suspicion. Gossip and reputation were incredibly important because your standing in the community could determine whether you received help in times of need or were left to suffer alone. Women in particular were subject to intense scrutiny of their behavior, and accusations of sexual impropriety could destroy a woman's reputation and her family's standing. The community could also turn viciously against individuals who were seen as threats or scapegoats, leading to witch hunts, persecutions, and mob violence. The concept of romantic love as we understand it was also quite different in the medieval world. Marriage was primarily an economic and social arrangement rather than a union based on affection or personal compatibility. Among the nobility, marriages were arranged to forge political alliances, consolidate landholdings, or secure advantageous economic connections. Among peasants, marriages were arranged to combine labor and resources, creating household units that could survive and reproduce. Love might develop between married partners over time, and certainly many couples developed genuine affection and care for each other, but it was not expected or required. The concept of marrying for love, of choosing your own partner based on romantic attraction and emotional connection, was seen as foolish and impractical. This doesn't mean that medieval people didn't experience romantic feelings. They certainly did, and medieval literature is full of tales of passionate love affairs. But these stories were often about illicit love, love that transgressed social boundaries, precisely because socially sanctioned marriage was not based on such feelings. Sexual behavior and attitudes were also different from both modern views and from later periods like the Victorian era. The Catholic Church taught that sex was only appropriate within marriage and only for the purpose of procreation, and it prescribed detailed rules about what sexual acts were permissible even between married couples. In practice, however, sexual behavior was often more relaxed, especially among peasants, and premarital sexual activity was common. The Church's ideal of celibacy and sexual restraint was honored more in the breach than in the observance, and even clergy who were supposed to be celibate frequently had sexual relationships and children. Prostitution was widespread and generally tolerated as a necessary evil that prevented more serious sexual crimes. Public bathhouses often served as sites for sexual encounters, and the boundaries between bathing, socializing, and sexual activity were fluid. Homosexual behavior was officially condemned by the Church as a grievous sin, and those accused of sodomy could face severe penalties, including death. However, the extent to which these prohibitions were enforced varied greatly, and some historians argue that same-sex relationships were more tolerated in practice than official doctrine would suggest, especially when they involved people of high social status. As with many aspects of medieval life, there was often a significant gap between official teachings and actual behavior, and people found ways to navigate between strict religious rules and human desires and weaknesses. Let's turn our attention to the environmental conditions of the medieval world, which would seem both familiar and alien to modern eyes. The natural landscape was less developed and more wild than it is today in most places. Forests covered much more of Europe than they do now, and these forests were dark, dense, and genuinely dangerous places. They harbored wolves, bears, and wild boar, all of which could pose threats to humans. Forests were also associated with outlaws and bandits who hid there to escape justice, and with supernatural beings like fairies and spirits in folklore and superstition. People ventured into forests to hunt, to gather wood and other resources, and to graze pigs on fallen acorns and other mast, but they did so warily and usually in groups. Rivers and streams were vital resources, providing water, transportation, and power for mills, but they were also hazards. There were few bridges, and those that existed were often poorly maintained and could collapse. Crossing rivers meant fording them when they were shallow enough or using ferries when they were deeper, both risky propositions. Rivers flooded regularly, destroying crops and homes, and sometimes drowning people and animals. The water quality, as we've discussed, was poor, and rivers served as dumping grounds for waste and as sources of disease. The air quality in medieval cities was terrible, filled with smoke from countless fires, the stench of human and animal waste, and the smells of various industries like tanning and metalworking that produced noxious fumes. The countryside had cleaner air, but it too was affected by smoke from slash-and-burn agriculture and from the constant fires used for heating and cooking. There was no concept of pollution or environmental protection, and people simply accepted foul air and water as normal parts of life. The night sky, however, would have been spectacular in a way that is difficult for most modern people to experience. Without light pollution, the stars would have been brilliantly visible on clear nights, and the Milky Way would have been a prominent feature of the night sky. Medieval people were much more aware of astronomical phenomena than most of us are today, because the movements of celestial bodies were their primary way of marking time and seasons. They knew the constellations, could identify planets, and paid attention to events like eclipses and comets, which were often interpreted as omens or signs from God. The pace of life was much slower in the medieval world, governed by natural rhythms rather than by clocks and schedules. Days blended into each other with a sameness that could be both comforting and monotonous. The passage of time was marked by the seasons, by religious festivals, by births and deaths, and by the occasional disruption of war or disaster. News traveled slowly, and people often went months or years without learning of events happening in other regions. This created a sense of isolation, but also of stability, a feeling that the world beyond your immediate community was distant and largely irrelevant to your daily life. Let's consider how knowledge was transmitted in a world without printing presses, mass literacy, or formal education systems. The vast majority of knowledge was transmitted orally, passed down from generation to generation through stories, songs, proverbs, and direct instruction. This oral tradition preserved enormous amounts of practical knowledge about agriculture, crafts, medicine, law, and history, but it was also prone to errors, distortions, and losses. Important information could be forgotten if it wasn't regularly repeated and reinforced, and there was no way to easily verify or correct information once it had been transmitted. For the literate minority, knowledge was preserved in manuscripts that were painstakingly copied by hand, usually by monks working in monastery scriptoria. This was slow, expensive work, and it meant that books were rare and precious objects, available only to the wealthy and to religious institutions. The copying process also introduced errors, as copyists made mistakes or sometimes deliberately altered texts they were copying. There was no standardized spelling, grammar, or even letters, so the same word might be spelled differently in different manuscripts or even in different parts of the same manuscript. Illustrations in manuscripts were often beautiful works of art, but they too could introduce inaccuracies if the artist didn't understand what they were depicting. The content of medieval manuscripts ranged from religious texts like Bibles, prayer books, and theological works to classical texts that had been preserved from ancient Greece and Rome, to practical manuals on subjects like agriculture, medicine, and law. Much ancient knowledge had been lost during the collapse of the Roman Empire and the chaos that followed, and medieval scholars spent considerable effort trying to recover and understand classical texts, often working from translations that had passed through multiple languages. Arabic scholars had preserved many Greek texts that had been lost in Europe, and the translation of these works from Arabic back into Latin was one of the major intellectual achievements of the medieval period. Universities began to develop in the 12th and 13th centuries, providing more formal education for a small elite of students, mostly men, who were being trained for careers in the church, law, or medicine. University education was based on lectures and disputations, with students memorizing and debating the interpretations of authoritative texts. The curriculum was divided into the trivium, which consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, which consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These 7 liberal arts formed the foundation of medieval higher education, and they were meant to train the mind and prepare students for more advanced study of theology, law, or medicine. The intellectual life of medieval universities was vibrant and sophisticated, with scholars engaging in complex debates about philosophy, theology, and natural science. However, the framework within which they operated was constrained by the authority of the Church and the classical texts. Original thinking was not valued as highly as careful interpretation and synthesis of existing knowledge, and radical ideas that challenged established doctrines were dangerous. Some scholars did push boundaries and introduce new concepts, but they had to do so carefully and often disguised their innovations as mere clarifications or reinterpretations of ancient wisdom. Let's think about what death and dying looked like in the medieval world, because this was something that people encountered far more frequently than we do today. Death was everywhere and unavoidable, claiming people of all ages, but especially the very young and the very old. Infant mortality has already been mentioned, but it bears repeating. Families expected to lose children, and parents often had many children, in part because they knew that not all would survive to adulthood. This constant proximity to death shaped medieval attitudes and created a culture that was simultaneously more accepting of death and more fearful of it than ours. When someone became seriously ill or injured, their family and community would recognize fairly quickly that death was likely. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no intensive care units, no life support machines that could keep people alive indefinitely. People died at home, surrounded by family and often by neighbors and community members who came to keep vigil. A priest would be called to administer the last rites, a series of Catholic sacraments meant to prepare the soul for death and the afterlife. This included confession of sins, anointing with holy oil, and receiving communion one final time. For medieval Christians, these final sacraments were crucially important, offering the hope of salvation and easing the terror of what came after death. The dying person would be encouraged to make peace with God, to forgive those who had wronged them, and to ask forgiveness from those they had wronged. They might dictate a final will if they had any property to distribute, though for most peasants this was not necessary since they owned almost nothing. Family members would maintain a watch over the dying person, praying and offering comfort until the end came. Death itself was often preceded by days or even weeks of decline, with the person becoming weaker, less responsive, and eventually slipping into unconsciousness before finally passing away. After death, the body would be washed and shrouded by family members, usually women who specialized in this task. There was no embalming for common people, so burial had to occur quickly before decomposition became obvious and offensive. The body would be carried to the church for a funeral mass, then buried in the churchyard in a simple grave, often without a marker. Only the wealthy could afford elaborate tombs or burial inside the church itself. The grave would be dug by hand, and multiple bodies might be placed in the same plot over time as space in churchyards was limited. Eventually, older graves would be disturbed to make room for new burials, and bones from earlier interments might be collected and placed in a charnel house, a storage building for human remains. Grief was expressed more publicly in medieval times than is common in modern Western culture. Mourners would wail, tear their clothes, and engage in dramatic displays of sorrow, especially at the funerals of important people. Professional mourners might even be hired to increase the spectacle of grief. However, the practical demands of life meant that mourning periods could not be prolonged indefinitely. Work had to continue, and surviving family members had to figure out how to carry on without the deceased, whether that meant a widow finding a way to support her children, a widower remarrying to have someone to manage his household, or children being sent to live with relatives if both parents died. The medieval belief in an afterlife was absolute and central to how people understood death. Heaven, purgatory, and hell were understood as real places where souls went after death, and a person's fate in the afterlife was determined by how they had lived their earthly life. The promise of heaven offered comfort to those facing death and to those mourning the dead, while the threat of hell encouraged moral behavior and obedience to religious and social rules. Purgatory, a concept that was developed and elaborated during the medieval period, was understood as a place of temporary punishment where souls were purified of their sins before being admitted to heaven. The living could help deceased souls in purgatory through prayers, masses, and charitable acts performed in their memory, which created an ongoing bond between the living and the dead. As we approach the end of our journey through the medieval world, it should be clear that you wouldn't last a day in the age of the Crusades, Or if you somehow survived that first day, your life would be so filled with hardship, suffering, and constant threats that you would barely recognize yourself. Everything that makes modern life comfortable, safe, and meaningful would be stripped away. You would be hungry, cold, dirty, and in pain most of the time. You would watch people around you suffer and die from causes that are easily preventable or treatable today. You would have no freedom to choose your own path in life, no opportunity to pursue your interests or develop your talents, no voice in how you were governed or what rules you had to follow. You would be trapped in a rigid social hierarchy with no hope of advancement, forced to work endlessly at back-breaking labor that would wear your body down until you were old and broken by what we would consider middle age. You would be surrounded by violence, disease, and death, living in constant fear of the many things that could kill you or your loved ones. You would be subject to the arbitrary authority of lords, kings, and priests who cared nothing for you as an individual and saw you merely as a resource to be exploited. Your mind would be constrained by ignorance and superstition, unable to understand the true causes of the phenomena around you or to imagine alternatives to the harsh reality you inhabited. And yet, the medieval people who actually lived through these conditions managed not just to survive, but to build communities, create art and literature, pass down knowledge and traditions, raise families, find moments of joy and beauty, and give their lives meaning through faith, relationships, and the simple satisfaction of work completed and duties fulfilled. They were no less human than we are, no less intelligent or capable of complex thoughts and emotions. They were no less human than we are, no less intelligent or capable of complex thoughts and emotions. They loved, they laughed, they hoped, and they dreamed, even in circumstances that seem unimaginably terrible to us. Their resilience and endurance in the face of such overwhelming hardship is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. The age of the Crusades was a time of faith and fanaticism, of brutality and nobility, of ignorance and sophistication, all mixed together in ways that are difficult for us to fully understand from our modern perspective. It was a time when people believed absolutely in things that we know to be false, when they accepted conditions that we would find intolerable, and when they did things that we would consider monstrous, all while believing themselves to be acting rightly and piously. It was also a time that shaped the world we live in today, when events and decisions made by medieval people set in motion currents that still affect us centuries later. Looking back at the medieval world helps us appreciate just how much has changed, how many advances have been made in medicine, technology, science, human rights, and quality of life. It reminds us that progress, however uneven and incomplete, is real and has genuinely improved the human condition in countless ways. At the same time, studying this period with honesty and empathy helps us understand that people in very different circumstances from our own are still fully human, still deserving of respect and understanding, and still capable of both great cruelty and great kindness. The medieval world may seem impossibly distant and alien, but it was inhabited by people who shared our fundamental nature, who faced the challenges of their time with courage and creativity, and who passed down to us a complex legacy that includes both things we celebrate and things we reject. If you were somehow transported back to the age of the Crusades, you would find yourself tested in ways you can barely imagine, facing challenges that would push you to your absolute limits and probably beyond them. You would discover strengths you didn't know you had and weaknesses you never had to confront in your comfortable modern life. You would learn what it means to be truly hungry, truly cold, truly in pain without relief. You would learn to live without privacy, without comfort, without the thousands of small conveniences that make modern life bearable. You would learn to endure suffering, to work despite exhaustion, to go on living even when death seemed preferable. But perhaps, if you somehow managed to survive and adapt, you would also learn things that modern life has made it easy to forget. You might learn the value of community and mutual dependence in a way that our individualistic culture makes difficult. You might learn to find contentment in simple things, to appreciate a full belly and a warm fire in a way that people who have never known real hunger or cold cannot. You might develop a resilience and toughness that modern comfort has made unnecessary for most of us. You might even find meaning and purpose in a life stripped down to its most basic elements, focused on survival, family, and faith, rather than on the pursuit of wealth, status, or self-actualization. Or perhaps not. Perhaps you would simply suffer and die, as so many medieval people did, your life cut short by disease or violence or simple misfortune, leaving no trace behind, forgotten by history like countless millions of others. That, after all, was the fate of most people who lived in the age of the Crusades. They lived, they struggled, they suffered, and they died, and the world moved on without them. Their individual stories are lost to us, known only to whatever God they believed in. We can only look back at the broad outlines of their world, trying to imagine what it must have been like to live in such different circumstances, knowing that our imagination falls short of the reality. The truth is, you wouldn't last a day in the age of the Crusades, not as you are now, with your modern body adapted to modern comforts, your modern mind shaped by modern education and values, your modern expectations of what life should be like. You would be utterly unprepared for the reality of medieval life, and that reality would overwhelm you. But the fact that you couldn't survive in their world doesn't mean that you're weak or that they were somehow superhuman. It simply means that human beings are products of their environments, shaped by the circumstances in which they live, and that what seems normal and endurable in one time and place can seem impossible in another. The medieval people who lived through the age of the Crusades were not stronger or tougher than we are in any fundamental sense. They were simply adapted to their harsh world in ways that we are not, just as we are adapted to our complex modern world in ways that they could not have imagined. If we could somehow switch places, a medieval peasant transported to the 21st century would be just as overwhelmed and confused by our world as we would be by theirs. They would find our technology incomprehensible, our social systems bizarre, our values alien. They would be astonished by how long we live, how healthy we are, how much food we have, and how much leisure time we enjoy. They would also probably be horrified by what they perceived as our godlessness, our individualism, our lack of respect for traditional authority and hierarchies. This thought experiment of imagining yourself in the medieval world is valuable, not because it tells us that the past was terrible and we should be grateful for the present, though that is certainly true. It's valuable because it helps us develop empathy for people who lived in very different circumstances, because it reminds us that what seems natural and inevitable about our world is actually contingent and historically specific, and because it makes us think about what truly matters in human life when all the comforts and distractions are stripped away. In the end, medieval people wanted the same things we want: to survive, to protect their loved ones, to find meaning and purpose, to leave some mark on the world, to be remembered. They just had to pursue those universal human goals in circumstances that were vastly more difficult than what most of us will ever face. So no, you wouldn't last a day in the age of the Crusades. But understanding why, understanding all the ways in which that world was different from ours, and all the challenges that medieval people faced and somehow overcame, that's a valuable exercise in historical imagination and human empathy. It reminds us of how far we've come, how much we take for granted, and how resilient the human spirit can be, even in the most difficult circumstances. The medieval world is gone, swept away by centuries of change and progress, but the people who inhabited it were our ancestors, literally or figuratively, and their struggles and triumphs are part of our shared human story. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.